Well, it happened. Trump was officially arrested today. He was not handcuffed, but he was fingerprinted after he surrendered himself. And you can see him being escorted by Secret Service as he heads out to the courthouse in a presidential motorcade. Protesters gathered outside in front of both Trump Tower and the courthouse. But there's been no violence so far. I know some in the security state are just salivating over the idea of labeling more Americans terrorists. So let's just hope everything continues to remain peaceful. So the big news is the indictment has been unsealed. We now know what criminal charges Trump faces. And according to Manhattan District Attorney Alvin Bragg, Trump is being charged with 34 felony counts of falsifying business records related to hush money payments to two separate women, Stormy Daniels and Karen McDougal. Now, the DA's press release states, quote, "The people of the state of New York allege that Donald J. Trump repeatedly and fraudulently falsified New York business records to conceal crimes that hid damaging information from the voting public during the 2016 presidential election. Manhattan is home to the country's most significant business market. We cannot allow New York businesses to manipulate their records to cover up criminal conduct." As the statement of fact describes, the trail of money and lies exposes a pattern that the people allege violates one of New York's basic and fundamental business laws. As this office has done time and time again, we today uphold our solemn responsibility to ensure that everyone stands equal before the law. Well, when you read through the indictment, the 34 counts are basically each and every bookkeeping transaction that happened in relation to the hush money payments. So, for example, an invoice was made, an entry was made in the company's ledger, a second entry was made on the same day, even in the company's detail ledger. A check was cut, and so forth. So each written action relating to the two payments amounted to 34 different actions, which were then turned into 34 felony charges. Now, the question is, how are payments to porn stars and bookkeeping notes amounting to felony crimes? Here to help us understand the charges is attorney Jenna Ellis. Jenna was a senior advisor and member of Donald Trump's legal team. She's now the host of the Jenna Ellis Show on American Family Radio. Jenna, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me, Kim.
So help us understand this. So these are, first of all, 34 separate felony crimes. Is that right?
Right. Well, and as you mentioned in your opening, these allegations and the charges, each of the 34 rely as felonies on underlying criminal conduct. And so what Alvin Bragg has not with specificity pled in this indictment is what the substance of those underlying criminal conduct supposedly is. And so if he's suggesting, as he did in his press conference, that it may relate to campaign finance violations and those particular potential federal crimes, how this falls under a state statute or a state prosecution is really anybody's guess. And when he was asked by a reporter in that press conference, why isn't this underlying conduct pled with specificity? The reporter didn't ask it, in quite that exact phrasing, but that was the substance of the question. He replied that New York law doesn't require him to. So I think that it's very interesting how he's supposedly coming out saying this is all for law and order, and we're certainly going to prosecute Trump, but the substance of the indictment really isn't there. Without the underlying conduct, it would be the same thing, Kim, as charging someone with felony murder, which requires that a person in the course of killing someone or even accidentally a death occurs, they are committing a crime while that death occurs. You can't have felony murder without underlying criminal conduct. So here you can't have falsifying business records in the first degree and a felony without some underlying crime. I just don't think there's any there.
So I want to kind of paint this picture for those who haven't read the indictment in full. It says for each and every charge, quote, with intent to defraud and intent to commit another crime. So this sort of bookkeeping stuff, is maybe a crime, maybe not a crime, maybe a misdemeanor, maybe not. But in order to turn it into a felony, you're saying they've got to have another crime. You've got to have hush money. Hush money is only a crime if it's connected to a crime. Otherwise, you could be charged with giving your kid, paying off your kid to not tell mom or dad something like, here's some ice cream. Don't tell mom or dad, this XYZ thing. It's not a crime to say. Right. Okay. So there's got to be a crime that you're trying to cover up. Or is
Right.
that
So
okay?
generally, in this situation, if this type of offense is charged, then, for example, it would be something like a person is embezzling from their corporation, and so they change the bookkeeping records to cover up their embezzlement. And the embezzlement standing alone in and of itself is a separate crime. But here, when it just says other crime in the indictment that you just read, we don't actually know what's being alleged here.
Yeah, because having sex with a porn star is not a crime. It might be immoral, unethical, cheating on your wife. There's a lot of things around that maybe make you look like a bad character who's running for president, but it's not a crime in and of itself, right?
Right, right, and even paying this hush money. What we do know, and the facts that are in public record, are that Michael Cohen, who is a convicted perjurer himself, who's now changing his story, said that he paid that without any reimbursements at all from Donald Trump or the Trump organization. And we also have a statement that was signed by Stormy Daniels herself saying that this alleged incident between her and President Trump, this alleged affair, never even occurred. So the speculation, of course, is that Michael Cohen was paying her for something else, maybe his own conduct. I mean, who knows? But this certainly, nothing, at least in the public record, and nothing that has been alleged so far, would amount to any sort of criminal activity. And like you said, whether it's tasteless, immoral, it's vulgar, all of those other things that we could certainly talk about in more of a faith-related context, it certainly doesn't rise to the level of criminal activity.
Okay, so help us understand, why is it a crime to have your lawyer, if I were to give my attorney some money and I'd say, go pay off that person that's trying to, why, I feel like lawyers do that every day. That's like the job of a lawyer, is to constantly settle disputes between people with money oftentimes. So how would that be a crime?
Well, and this is why the intent piece would be so hard to prove, even if the DA could prove that Michael Cohen paid this at the direction of Donald Trump, and that this $130,000 payment to Stormy Daniels was in fact to cover up, or hush money for Donald Trump, not for Cohen himself, or for some other uh, purpose. But the way that the DA is trying to kind of bootstrap this, from what I understand from what has been alleged by the DA, is that the criminal activity would be that this was specifically, the purpose of it was for a campaign finance related payment, that in order to keep her from talking, or from having something come out during the course of the campaign, it was actually a campaign finance expenditure that should have been reported as such on the campaign, under the campaign finance laws. But again, you have to then show intent. You have to show that this payment was made expressly and solely for that purpose, not because, well, maybe Trump wanted to keep his marriage intact, or maybe he doesn't want to have other negative headlines. I mean, so there are so many multiple steps for the DA to even get there. He still doesn't really have any sort of crime that he's really alleging.
Yeah, this seems like a lot of stretches are having to be, you're having to make a lot of leaps in order to make this a crime. So you're saying if Trump were not running for president at the time, then this would have not been a crime. I don't know, because I don't see how this is any different than a non-disclosure agreement, which companies do all the time when employees are parting. It's like, okay, so if he wasn't running, this would have been just nothing, no crime committed.
Right, and that's what everyone is saying, and why Alvin Bragg will have such a difficult time proving that this was solely related and intended to be for the purposes of the Trump 2016 campaign. He also has an issue with the statute of limitations, just as a threshold issue, because even if he gets all of those things down and he can prove all of that beyond any and all reasonable doubt to a jury, he's still going to have the problem of the statute of limitations, which in New York, and I'm not licensed in New York, so I'm just taking some of the other legal experts' word for it, that the statute of limitations would be 2 years for a misdemeanor and 5 years for a felony. And there can be some exceptions to that, or tolling of the clock in some instances if he's out of the state, which of course he was while he was in office and now living in Florida. But you still don't get there with these types of violations allegedly occurring all the way back in 2015 and 2016.
Okay, so if it's a campaign finance violation, that means that you're not allowed as a candidate to use campaign money for these types of things without disclosing it, right? You have to actually come for, or can you actually, I mean, I don't know if you're an expert in campaign finance law, but can you actually make a payment like this, but as long as you disclose it and say, yeah, I paid off a porn star so she wouldn't talk. Would that be okay?
Well, and I'm not an expert in campaign finance law, but my understanding would be that if you make a campaign finance expenditure, then you have to report it, because this all comes down to making sure that the books are in order. And so whether or not this is allowed to enter into some sort of NDA under a campaign finance related expenditure, my understanding is as long as the campaign were to have paid for it and this was expressly written as such, then that may have under some circumstances been okay. But the allegation here is that it was paid through the lawyer so that it was basically done for purposes to influence the campaign, but was not expressly an expenditure.
They're going to have a hard time with this. And one of the big things that could just be brought up is the fact that no one thought when Trump was running for president that he was this moral, upstanding guy. I mean, nobody thought
Right.
he wasn't sleeping around with young, beautiful women. We all knew this about him. That's not new. So there's no motivation for him to want to pay off porn stars in order to save his campaign. That's not as likely as wanting to save his marriage. That sounds a bit more likely. And if that's the case, I would think then it would come from his personal accounts, which I'm sure the money did. I think it did come from his personal accounts. They're just trying to say, no, but this was for campaign, so therefore it was actually campaign money that you yourself were
Well,
donating to your own
this,
campaign.
yeah, this whole entire line of argument from Alvin Bragg, I mean, the legal experts who are calling this, trying to bootstrap, and as I've tried to articulate, Alvin Bragg is manipulating himself into a legal pretzel to just try to get
Yeah.
that threshold prima facie case, and I just don't see that it's there. And this is so embarrassing for an unprecedented action as to indict a former sitting president who is the top contender right now for the GOP nomination for the presidency in a future election year. And to have this kind of non-substance of an indictment is frankly an embarrassment to the entire judiciary. And what's so interesting as well, Kim, just from a political perspective, is that the leftists have been telling us for years about critical theory and how systemic injustice occurs all the time and is baked in to our legal system and our justice system. And that was part of their justification for the BLM riots and all of this other stuff that we all went through in 2020 in the aftermath. And now suddenly we're supposed to believe that just in this one instance of prosecuting Donald Trump, that the system is totally unbiased, completely fair. It'll be a totally fair trial. And the DA, who is a Democrat that ran on a campaign promise to prosecute Donald Trump, is somehow fair. I mean, this is just so ridiculous. Any reasonable judge would look at this and would grant a motion to dismiss. And I assume that those threshold motions on procedural grounds will be forthcoming from the Trump defense team soon.
Yeah, this just sounds like a big bookkeeping error. And then it's just you have to prove this intent that he was trying to pay off these porn stars in order to save his campaign, which is, again, not likely considering we all knew everything that Trump was about prior to this point. Another question for you. This is 34 felony counts. Do you know if this is going to be a judge or a jury? I would imagine this is a jury that is going to be hearing this out. How are they going to find a
Yes,
fair
well,
jury?
pursuant to our U.S. Constitution, any sort of criminal case like this requires a jury, and so it would be a jury of 12, and they have to be unanimous in their verdict, unless in some instances the defendant can waive a jury trial and request a bench trial. I doubt that that would happen in this instance, but Donald Trump is certainly entitled to a jury, but he's also entitled to an unbiased jury. And so I also anticipate that the Trump legal team is looking at their options in terms of motions for change of venue, potentially looking at the bias of the judge who has previously sat on Trump organization related cases. Some other things are coming out as well about, maybe some other donations or political activity of the judge's family. I don't believe that that is in and of itself enough to have a judge have to recuse himself. But all of these things I anticipate are being very carefully calculated by the Trump legal team, and we're going to see a flurry of pretrial motions coming up pretty soon.
And then just so that everybody understands, when he goes to trial, he's going to have to be found guilty or not guilty on all 34 individual counts, 34 different times. Is this normal, 34 felony counts? It seems like excessive. I've heard 8, 11. I mean, 34 just sounds like is that a normal amount?
I've seen indictments and complaints with, hundreds of counts. So, I mean, it's not actually really that unprecedented that it's 34. It just seems, though, like Alvin Bragg is trying to throw up against the wall whatever sticks and hope that, a few counts survive motions to dismiss, maybe trying to sever those particularly. But yes, a jury would have to find evidence that convicts beyond any and all reasonable doubt on each individual count. And so it is possible, if this case proceeds to trial and verdict, that he could be found guilty on some and not others.
Wow. Well, I guess we'll wait and see. When are we expecting all of this to go down?
Well, reports are suggesting today that motions will be heard sometime in August, and the case is currently set for trial in January. Whether or not those timelines are ultimately are held to, I think really depends on the substance and volume of the pretrial motions. That's a little quick, but I anticipate that the judge is not going to really want this to sit on his docket for very long. But I also think that we'll see what happens also out of the grand juries in Fulton County, Georgia, and also in Washington, D.C., and whether or not indictments are handed down in those cases, particularly against Donald Trump, may impact the timeline here and how those cases are also handled. But, this just across the board, I don't see anything that is actually legitimate that isn't just politically influenced against Donald Trump. And it seems to me that the real goal here from the Democrats is to just distract, to persuade the court of public opinion that he is unfit. Of course, he's constitutionally fit to run for office, but also to drain his campaign war chest, because defenses like this and a defense team are not cheap.
Oh, interesting. That's an interesting perspective on that. Yeah, because all this is going to do is give him more publicity. And I mean, if they really wanted to play this, they would have just tried to keep him out of the public eye, keep him out of the news, so that no one's talking about him. But instead, he's going to be all the time, primetime news all the time, if they continue with these indictment after indictment, the other ones that he's facing. And hopefully they have more than this, because this is obviously political persecution. These are bookkeeping errors. The intent, this is, I mean, look, if the guy was guilty of something, if I felt, yeah, okay, no one's above the law, sure, but this does seem a bit ridiculous. It doesn't seem like
and no one is below the law either. And what we're seeing is a double standard that has been implemented for far too long against Democrats, and then a double standard against Republicans. And so Donald Trump deserves the very same due process protections as every other citizen of the United States of America. He does not deserve to have a government office weaponized against him, just like no American deserves to have a government office weaponized against them for their political viewpoints or just because they're the most favorable candidate. But it is interesting, Kim, about campaign finance. Donald Trump has been touting that he raised about $8 million in the last, 24, 48 hours since this indictment was handed down. But the DeSantis PAC, and Ron DeSantis hasn't even declared his candidacy yet, but he is likely the top rival for the GOP nomination. His super PAC just announced this week that they have raised over $30 million. And so this will come down to the high donor dollars, and those high value donors are looking like they are going toward Ron DeSantis out of Florida, where the grassroots and anyone who is reasonable and fair-minded, of course, supports Donald Trump against the weaponization of government. But whether or not the base overall, it kind of has Trump fatigue, I think you're seeing that in a lot of the high-level donors, and I think it's going to be very interesting what the polls suggest once Ron DeSantis actually declares.
Well, they'll be able to write them off as establishment donors anyway. And that is exactly how Ron DeSantis is going to be painted when it comes to Ron DeSantis versus Trump. He's just going to be painted as the establishment candidate. And that might be true. I don't know. I haven't looked. We don't know enough about Ron DeSantis' policies to know.
That way.
You
Yeah,
think
I think
so?
it's unfair for people to paint him that way only because of his record in office. And, he was the one defending Donald Trump in Congress against the Mueller Russia hoax. I mean, people have, such a short term memory in terms of what his accomplishments actually were. And I think that what he's done in the state of Florida, I mean, Donald Trump himself endorsed him and voted for him.
Yeah.
And everyone who's conservative knows that the free state of Florida is the place to be. So I don't think it's going to work to paint him as the establishment candidate. And listen, whether or not he's the better candidate than Donald Trump, I think the voters are going to decide that. But I do think it's going to be a much more interesting race than what the polls are currently suggesting and what the dollar amounts are currently suggesting. And I think that for Team Trump, just to try to paint him as like this Republican in name only candidate is not going to get them very far once they actually are going to have to face Ron DeSantis's accomplishments on the debate stage. So I think it's going to be a much more interesting primary than a lot of people think.
Yeah, it'll definitely come down to who those donors are, I think, in a lot of cases. But yeah, the fatigue is real, and this definitely will be tying Trump up for a while if he's going to be going from court to court to court, battling this out.
Which is so unfair.
It is. It's very unfair. It is very unfair. He should, and you're right. The American people should have a right to choose between the candidates that they want in the primaries and in the general election. And here's Democrats who sit there and scream about a democracy, fair elections. And this is absolutely not fair, what is happening here. The American people do have the right to decide and should have that opportunity without all of this circus that's going on. So, Jenna, thank you so much for joining the show. It's really great to hear from you and your perspective. Jenna Ellis, she is the host of the Jenna Ellis Show on American Family Radio, so you could check it out. Thank you, Jenna.
Thanks, Kim. Appreciate it.
Well, guys, we are experiencing out of control inflation, and though the Fed keeps raising rates, it doesn't seem to be working, which means something else could be going on. Long-term bonds have diminished in value. Banks are going under. Depositors are holding their breath, and investors are bailing on bank stocks. Diversification has never been more important. The recent surge in gold prices is directly tied to the extreme market volatility right now. This is why gold has historically been a great hedge against the stock market and against inflation. So now would be a great time to diversify into gold with Birch Gold Group. Birch Gold makes it easy to convert an IRA or 401k into an IRA in precious metals. Here's what you need to do. Visit birchgold.com/Kim to get a free info kit on gold. They're going to help you convert your existing IRA or 401k that's tied to the volatile market into an IRA in physical precious metals, gold and silver. And the best part is it's tax sheltered. So visit birchgold.com/Kim to claim your free info kit on gold today. Birch Gold has an A+ rating with the Better Business Bureau, thousands of happy customers, and countless 5-star reviews. Birch Gold is who you can trust to protect your future. So once again, visit birchgold.com/Kim today.